The night my uncle told me I had 72 hours to clear out of the house I grew up in, it was -23 outside, and the furnace had just kicked on for the first time that November. I remember that detail, the furnace, because I stood there in the hallway listening to it hum while he talked, and I kept thinking about how my father had replaced that furnace the winter before he died. Not paid for it out of pocket, $11,000, because he said a man's house should never be cold. That house wasn't mine anymore, apparently. My name is Daniel. I was 22 when my father, Robert Calloway, died of a cardiac event in the parking lot of his office building in Mississauga. He was 58. He'd been in good health, or so we thought. No warning. His assistant found him at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning, slumped against the driver's side door of his truck. By the time the paramedics arrived, he was already gone. I was finishing my second year at Laurier when I got the call. My sister, Nadia, she's 2 years younger than me, was still in high school. Our mother had passed when we were kids, a car accident on the 401 when Nadia was 4 and I was 6, so it had always been the three of us, Dad, Nadia, and me. Dad's brother, my Uncle Glenn, came around for Christmas and the occasional Thanksgiving, but he wasn't close. He and my father had some old disagreement that neither of them ever fully explained to us. Dad would just say, "Glenn sees money differently than I do," and leave it at that. I didn't understand what that meant until the week after the funeral. Glenn arrived at the house on a Wednesday. He had a folder under his arm and a lawyer, a man named Bryce, standing slightly behind him like a shadow. Glenn sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where my father used to make pancakes on Saturday mornings, and he slid a document across to me. I looked at it. I looked at him. "Your father didn't leave a formal will," Glenn said, "which means the estate falls to next of kin. I'm his only surviving sibling. The house, the investment accounts, the business, it all passes to me." I told him that wasn't right. My father had talked about a will. He'd mentioned it more than once. Glenn shrugged. "If there's a will, no one's found it. And until someone does, I'm acting as administrator of the estate." Bryce, the lawyer, nodded along like a bobblehead. I would learn later that Bryce worked almost exclusively for Glenn. He wasn't there to help the estate. He was there to help Glenn. Within a week, Glenn had changed the locks on the house. Within 2 weeks, he'd frozen access to my father's primary bank accounts that Nadia and I had been using for groceries and utilities. He gave us 72 hours to take whatever personal belongings we could carry and find somewhere else to go. Nadia was 17. She was in the middle of her grade 12 year. She stood in the doorway of her bedroom, holding a framed photo of our dad, and I watched her trying not to cry in front of me. That was the moment I understood what my father meant about Glenn and money. A friend of mine, Marcus, let us stay on his couch for 3 weeks. Then we found a basement apartment in Hamilton, low ceilings, one window in the bedroom, a radiator that clanged all night. Nadia took the bedroom. I slept on a pull-out sofa. She finished high school from that apartment. I deferred the rest of my degree. I took a job at a distribution warehouse, night shifts, because the pay was better and I didn't want to be awake during the days when I had too much time to think about everything we'd lost. For months, I kept calling around about the will. I talked to a legal aid clinic. They told me that without physical evidence of a will's existence, challenging Glenn's claim to administrator status would be expensive and difficult. I talked to my father's accountant, a man named Harpreet, who'd done his taxes for 15 years. Harpreet was sympathetic but careful. "Your father was a private man," he said. "He didn't always loop me in on everything." There was one thing I kept coming back to. One thing my father had said, maybe 8 months before he died, during a phone call where I'd asked him what I should do about the OSAP forms for my second year. He'd said, "Don't worry about money, Daniel. I've made arrangements. If anything ever happens to me, you and your sister are taken care of. I made sure of it." I turned that phrase over in my head for nearly a year. I turned it over while I loaded pallets at 2 in the morning. I turned it over on the drive home when the highway was empty and the sky over Hamilton was that particular gray that's not quite night anymore. I turned it over while Nadia finished her first semester at McMaster on a student loan I'd co-signed, because Glenn had cut off every account that could have helped her. Made sure of it, my father on Bruce County. A piece of land he'd bought in the 90s from an old farming family, a few acres near the Niagara Escarpment, with a small structure on it. Not a cabin exactly, more like a storage building with a loft. He'd never developed it. He went up there a few times a year, alone mostly, and he always came back quieter. I used to tease him about it as a kid. I'd call it his secret hideout, and he'd just smile and say, "Every man needs a place to think." Glenn had claimed the property as part of the estate. But here was the thing. Glenn had never been up there. He'd never shown any interest in it. And when I looked at the estate documents Bryce had filed, I got access through the legal aid clinic. The property was listed, but nothing on it had been inventoried. There was a line that just said, "Structure, rural property, no assessed value, no assessed value." Glenn's lawyer had decided it was worth nothing, so no one had gone to look at it. My father's keys were among the personal belongings I'd taken from the house. Glenn's people had been thorough with the paperwork, but they hadn't thought to collect keys. There was a ring of them. House keys, car keys, a small brass one I'd never been able to identify. I'd been carrying that ring for 11 months. I'd stared at that brass key probably 1,000 times. I told Nadia one Saturday in February that I was going to drive up to Bruce County. She asked if she could come. I almost said no. The roads were bad. It was a 3-hour drive, and I didn't know what we were going to find, or if we were going to find anything at all. But she looked at me the way she used to look at our dad when she wanted something, that particular steady look that meant she'd already made up her mind, and I said yes. We left Hamilton at 6 in the morning. The 400 north Bay of Barrie was clear, but the county roads were not. We drove through stretches where the snow had drifted across the asphalt, and I kept both hands on the wheel and said nothing. Nadia sat with her boots pulled up on the seat and scrolled through her phone until the signal dropped somewhere past Owen Sound. After that, she looked out the window. The property was at the end of a gravel road that had been plowed at some point, but not recently. I put the truck into 4-wheel drive. The trees on either side were birch and cedar, their branches low and heavy. We came around a bend, and I saw the building through the tree line. Small, maybe 400 square feet, board and batten siding that had weathered to silver, a metal roof with a ridge of snow along the top. There was a padlock on the door. Heavy duty, the kind you'd see on a storage unit. I got out of the truck. My boots broke through the crust of old snow with every step. I walked up to the door and I took out my father's key ring. The brass key slid into the padlock on the first try. It opened. Inside it was dark and it smelled like cedar and cold air and something else. Motor oil, maybe, or wood preservative. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. There was a workbench along one wall, tools hanging on pegboard, a propane heater in the corner, a camp cot folded up and leaning against the wall, and at the back, half hidden by a tarp, what looked like a shelving unit. I pulled the tarp off. It wasn't a shelving unit. It was a fireproof cabinet, the kind used in offices for document storage. 4 drawers, steel construction, combination lock on each drawer, but taped to the top of the cabinet, in a sealed plastic sleeve, was an envelope. My father's handwriting was on the front. It said, "Daniel and Nadia." My hands were not steady when I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, my father's handwriting again, dated 14 months before he died. It said, "If you've found this, it means something happened to me before I could make proper arrangements through a lawyer. This cabinet contains everything you need. The combination is your mother's birthday, month, day, year, 6 digits. I love you both. Trust what's inside." Dad. I read it twice. I handed it to Nadia. She read it once, and then she sat down on the concrete floor in her winter coat, and she held the paper against her chest, and she didn't say anything for a long time. Our mother's birthday, April 9th, 1971, 040971. The first drawer opened with a soft click. What my father had built in that cabinet was meticulous. He had been, above everything else, a methodical man. The first drawer contained a signed and witnessed copy of his last will and testament, notarized in 2019 by a notary public in Guelph, a woman named Catherine Fowler who, I would learn, had worked independently of any firm Glenn might have had influence over. The will was unambiguous. The house, the investment accounts, the business interests, all of it was to be held in trust for Nadia and me until I turned 25, at which point the trust dissolved and the assets transferred directly to us. There was no mention of Glenn. The second drawer contained something else. My father's business, Calloway Logistics, was a mid-sized freight brokerage. He'd built it from nothing over 20 years. After he died, Glenn had moved quickly to assert control over it, claiming authority as estate administrator. But the second drawer contained 18 months of financial records, internal records, not the ones filed publicly, showing a pattern that I did not initially understand, but that became very clear once I brought them to the right person. Glenn had been involved with Calloway Logistics before my father died. Not officially, not on any letterhead, but there were payment records, wire transfers from a numbered company that traced back to Glenn, for consulting fees that my father had never authorized. Someone had been skimming from the business. The amounts weren't enormous individually, but across 18 months they totaled just over $400,000. My father had known. He'd been collecting evidence. The third drawer contained correspondence, emails, printed and filed, between Glenn and Bryce going back nearly 2 years. The emails were specific enough that I barely needed to read them twice to understand what had happened. Glenn had known about the will's existence. He and Bryce had gambled that without the physical document, they could claim it didn't exist, move quickly, and control the estate before anyone had time to challenge them properly. They'd come within one key of being right. The fourth drawer contained a contact card clipped to a note in my father's handwriting. The contact was a forensic accountant, a woman named Dr. Sandra Mercer, based in Toronto, who my father had apparently already been in communication with. The note said, "She knows the basics. She's waiting to hear from you if needed." I sat in that cold building for a long time, reading. Nadia sat beside me. Neither of us spoke much. At some point I got up and found the propane heater and figured out how to light it, and the small space got warmer and we just sat there, two adults in their 20s in a building. Their father had quietly prepared for them, reading the careful proof of everything he'd known was coming. He hadn't been able to stop it in time, but he'd made sure we could. The drive back to Hamilton was different from the drive up. Something had shifted. I don't know how else to describe it. The same gray sky, the same highway, but I felt like I was carrying something solid instead of just anger. On Monday morning, I called Dr. Sandra Mercer. She answered on the second ring. She said, "I was wondering if I'd ever hear from you." We met in her office in the annex the following Thursday. She was in her 50s, direct, with the particular calm of someone who has spent decades translating financial wrongdoing into language a courtroom can understand. I brought everything from the cabinet. She spent 45 minutes going through it while I sat across from her desk and Nadia sat beside me. When she finished, she looked up and said, "This is thorough. Your father was very thorough." She referred us to an estate's lawyer, one she'd worked with before, a woman named Patricia Webb at a firm in downtown Toronto. Patricia reviewed the will, confirmed its validity, and within 3 weeks had filed with the Ontario Superior Court to have the existing estate administration order set aside. Glenn's lawyer, Bryce, pushed back. He filed a challenge claiming the will was potentially coerced, potentially invalid, potentially any number of things that required time and paper to dismiss. It was a delay tactic, and Patricia said so plainly. "He's buying time," she told us, "but he's not going to win. The notarization is solid, the witness documentation is solid, and he knows it." Glenn called me during this period. He called twice. The first time I didn't answer. The second time I did. He said, "Daniel, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was trying to protect the estate. Your father would have wanted." I said, "Don't." There was a silence. I said, "You had a lawyer present when you told a 22-year-old and a 17-year-old to leave their home in 72 hours. You froze the accounts they needed to buy groceries. You had $400,000 in fraudulent transfers going back 18 months. I paused. I'm not interested in what you think my father would have wanted. He didn't call again. The financial fraud case was a separate matter from the estate proceedings, but they moved in parallel. Dr. Mercer filed a detailed report with her findings. The RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit opened an investigation. Bryce, facing his own professional conduct review through the Law Society of Ontario, withdrew from representing Glenn in January. The estate proceedings concluded 4 months after we filed. The will was recognized. The administration order was overturned. The house in Mississauga, the investment accounts, the business interests, all of it came back to us. Nadia moved back into her childhood bedroom at the end of March. I stood in the front hallway and listened to the furnace and thought about my father paying $11,000 for a furnace he knew we'd need after he was gone. The fraud charges against Glenn were laid the following autumn. He entered a guilty plea to 1 count of fraud over $5,000 and 1 count of breach of trust. He received a conditional sentence and was ordered to repay the full amount with interest. Bryce received a 6-month suspension of his law license. Patricia told us that we might also be eligible to make a claim under Ontario's whistleblower provisions given the nature of the financial disclosure, and she was right. That process added another layer and another several months, but it resolved in our favor. I went back to Laurier and finished my degree. Nadia transferred to the University of Toronto for her 2nd year. We kept the house. We kept the business, though I eventually hired a proper management team to run it while I figured out what I actually wanted to do with my life. There was one last thing. Nadia and I drove back up to Bruce County the following spring on a Saturday in May when the birches had just come into leaf and the gravel road was dry and easy. We brought a folding table and 2 chairs and a thermos of coffee, and we sat outside the building our father had filled with everything we needed. Nadia said, "Do you think he knew he wasn't going to get to handle it himself?" I thought about it for a while. The financial records had been in that cabinet for at least a year before he died. The will had been notarized 2 years before. He'd already spoken to Dr. Mercer. He'd been building that cabinet like a man who understood that time might run out before the problem could be resolved any other way. I think, I said, he was hoping he'd never have to tell us about it, but he made absolutely sure that if he did, we'd find it. We sat there for a long time. The cedars moved in the wind off the escarpment. A pair of ravens landed on the roof and sat there like they were also thinking about something, and then they left. We locked the building on the way out. I kept the brass key. I keep it now on its own ring, separate from everything else, not because I think I'll need it again, but because it's the most honest thing my father ever gave me, and I'm not ready to put it away somewhere I might forget it. Some mornings I pick it up off the dresser and hold it for a moment before I leave the house. He always said a man's house should never be cold. What he meant, I think, was something bigger than that. What he meant was, no matter how hard things get, I will not leave you without a way through, and he didn't. The people who tried to take everything from us counted on us having nothing to fight back with. They forgot, or maybe they never knew, that the right person can leave you exactly what you need, even from a distance, even after they're gone. My father knew. And in the end, that was enough.